last speaker, very interesting speaker to my left here, said there's maybe no intersection whatsoever, and she might turn out to be right, but we're going to experiment a little bit to see if actually there is something we can learn from what campaigns of civil resistance are and how they put pressure on adversaries and how they lead to conclusions that could be certainly, I think, systemically useful for those who are concerned about illicit financial flows. So we're going to do this in two parts. Will I push the right thing? Yeah. The first is I'm going to talk about people power movements against authoritarian regimes in general. And generally what that means is that usually, from what I understand, illicit financial flows generally flow from countries with, let's say, low Freedom House scores, those that are not democracies or far from them, and that the major perpetrators and beneficiaries come from those parts of the world. And then Shaska is actually going to get to the other part of the equation, and this is really what Shaska's expertise is to talk about people power movements against corruption specifically, and dealing both with the perpetrator beneficiaries, somebody from the origin, and also the enablers. And I heard a lot today about the enablers in developed countries, and I don't know much about it, but Shaska does, and so let's see how it goes. So let's talk about what civil resistance is. Civil resistance is what people do when they're living under oppression and they simply won't accept the status quo anymore. So they also don't have a viable military option to basically deal with that oppression, which is usually enforced with violence. And so what they do is they initiate strikes, boycotts, mass protests. There's hundreds and hundreds of various kinds of tactics that basically disrupt the status quo, and that this disruption of the status quo uncovers within the authoritarian regime people that Natan Sharansky calls latent double thinkers. And this disruption creates the possibilities of coordinated behavior amongst these latent double thinkers that leads to defection and ultimately to the disintegration of a regime. Now, I'm going to spend a little time in a minute going into detail about the success rates of this kind of activity and how prevalent it is. But first, what I want to do is to make sure we have definitional clarity. I want to talk about what civil resistance is not. So there's a distinction between civil resistance, nonviolent conflict, nonviolent resistance, people power, and nonviolence or pacifism. Nonviolence is an ethic, a very admirable ethic in terms of what people choose to do relative to their relationship with other human beings, but in and itself is not what makes authoritarian regimes weaker. Neither is pacifism. And so you say, well, what about Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi? Well, if you look at Gandhi and King, what really distinguished them, particularly if you look at Gandhi, for example, is we're not really interested in Gandhi's views about the Bhagavad Gita, but we are interested in the fact that in 1930, he left his ashram, walked 214 miles to Dandi Beach, took a handful of sand, threw it in a pot of boiling water, made salt, which was illegal to do at that time, and 250 million people followed suit. And if you read the correspondence between the Viceroy and the various Secretaries of State, they made it very clear that if the loyalties of the constabulary were shifted in this process, and that only represented a key 100 and 150,000 people throughout India, that the British would have had to have left. So disruption leads to the potential for defection of key pillars of support the authoritarian needs to stay in power. These pillars of support might be ethnic, they might be bureaucratic, they might be economic, but they're always, to some degree, pillars that represent police and military activity. Civil resistance is not about mediation or peace building. This is not about how to negotiate getting to yes, because civil resistance begins when there's irreconcilable differences. And if you think of peace building as tranquility, these types of activities, whether it's the Gdansk shipyard strike in Poland or what happened in India that I described, or the movement against Pinochet, they were very disruptive activities and in some cases extended for years. They're also not spontaneous mass conflagrations. The most successful civil resistance movements were planned at some level. Somebody had a sense of how do I knit together a series of very disruptive tactics to create a strategic outcome in service to the goals of the conflict. And fourth is that they're not only street protests. They are many, many different kinds of tactics, as I just alluded to. So, for example, in Gdansk, in Poland, the Gdansk shipyard strike was critical. In South Africa, it was the Port Elizabeth consumer boycotts. In the United States, it was the Nashville lunch counter boycotts, bus boycotts, and protests. So my colleague Gene Sharp has listed 198 different types of tactics. And the thing that I think knits them together that's interesting to think is that there's really, I like to think of them as two really kinds of tactics. The first kind of tactics are tactics of commission, where you do something which your opponent wants you to stop doing. So that would be like a protest. And then there's tactics of omission, where you stop doing something that your opponent wants you to continue doing, which is what the Danish did when they did work slowdowns during World War II. One has a certain kind of risk characteristic and a certain level of participation. The other, which is more risky, which are tactics of commission, and tactics of omission are less risky, in some cases far more confounding to the opponent. Now, there's a lot of good news associated with this type of activity that's been recently uncovered in research that we've sponsored at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. By the way, there's two brochures about what we've done, our mission statement and what we've done for the first 10 years, that I hope you'll take a look at, because that'll also help you after my conversation in Shaska's to get a sense of where there might be an intersection between what we look at and what you're interested in today. So there's a book that came out recently by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan that won the Woodrow Wilson Award by the American Political Science Association as the best book in America on international and domestic politics in 2011. And they examined 323 cases of insurrection, both violent and nonviolent, and they basically separated them into two categories. There's approximately 2/3 were violent, and 1/3 were nonviolent. And what they discovered is that the nonviolent campaigns, based in both cases on the goals defined by those who were in the act of insurrection, achieved success 53% of the time compared to 26% for violent resistance campaigns. And believe me, if I had the time, I would explain to you why that's a logical result and why that should be expected. But let me move on. You could also see the success rates expressed in different ways. So nonviolent campaigns basically dominate success rates in successful, and then when you look at failure, they basically are dominated by violent campaigns, and the middle is somewhat even. It also, this spread between success rates of violent and nonviolent campaigns is spreading. So if you look at the differential in 1990 and 2006, and in 2000 to 2006, you'll see that nonviolent movements have a far better record of success than violent ones do. Now, in a study that I did with Freedom House, we looked at 67 transitions to authoritarian rule between 1972 and 2005. And what we discovered was that, based on correlation analysis, is that there was a high degree of correlation between levels of violence and Freedom House scores, meaning more democracy or less democracy, at the end of the transition. And so if you had low levels of violence, the likelihood of a democratic result was far greater than if you had high levels of violence in the transition. And that has to do with civilian participation, because in nonviolent conflicts, the levels of civilian participation are much higher than in violent conflicts, which are really conducted by a small group of highly athletic young men who are well financed and well armed. This is another way of expressing that. I feel a little bit time constrained, so I'm going to move on to, this is a phenomenally interesting graph that Chenoweth and Stefan had, is that the probability that a country will be a democracy 5 years after a campaign ends. In successful campaigns, as you see, the number is close to 60% with civil resistance movements, and very, very low with violent resistance movements. But even in failed campaigns, you still, after 5 years, have a 33% chance of success, and failed campaigns versus nothing. And again, this gets back to the issue of civilian participation and the disruption created by civilian participation, which requires high levels of coordination between lots of elements of civic society or civil society, is the key element here. And the habit-forming elements of how that occurs really is probably relevant to what we're going to be talking, what Shas is going to be talking about in a minute. Now, this findings really go very much counter to what political science theory was as late as the mid 80s. So this is Sam Huntington said, democratic regimes that last have seldom, if ever, been instituted by mass popular action, and that is just simply not true. Now, the other piece of good news, which I think you'll find interesting, is that one of the things people tell us, well, nonviolent resistance movements don't work when the authoritarian's really nasty and brutal. They don't work when you have countries that have tremendous ethnic divisions, or they don't work in countries whose economic prospects are very low. Well, we've actually done that study. That study's existed, and we've looked at all the campaigns of civil resistance and tried to find correlative variables, and we found that there's absolutely, contrary to what one might assume, factors such as regime type, level of economic development, literacy rates, fractionalization of society along ethnic, linguistic, and religious lines have not had a statistically significant impact on the ability of a civic movement to achieve success through civil campaigns. And so when people come up to us and say this won't work or that won't work a priori, the data doesn't show that. And so the question is, well, if these prior conditions are not critical to what defines success or failure, what is critical? And the answer is skills. Just like in a military campaign, there's knowledge to be gained from what people have done in the past and what is the generic factors that lead to skillful cases of civil resistance versus unskillful cases. And that's incredibly interesting news, and and one of the reasons why we're in demand, and this is an unusual place for us to express ourselves, is because if you look at Syria and compare it to Egypt, for example, today, both had choices to be made, and Tunisia, both had choices to be made about how they were going to work, resist against a regime that they couldn't stand. And Egypt basically went, and Tunisia went one way, where the violence has been essentially low, although not absent in Egypt. But there was an active civil resistance movement in Syria, and that was basically hijacked by a violent insurrection that's led to an incremental 120,000 deaths. And the reason why that happened is because the people who were developing the civil resistance movement in Syria really didn't have an appreciation, and it takes a little time to get one, as to what constitutes skills in this type of activity. And so I'm going to conclude, since I only have 15 minutes and I have 3 to go, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what it means to be skillful in a civil resistance movement and see if there's any overlap with what Shas is going to talk to you about. So if a civil resistance movement as a checklist is to be successful, you need the following things. First of all, you need a unifying vision about what kind of society you want to have after the conflict is waged. You need to be able to plan by using a variety of tactics and linking them together to have a strategy that basically has a theory about how you're going to undermine the authority of the regime. You have to maintain nonviolent discipline, because if you don't, the credibility, all sorts of bad things happen, including the credibility of your unifying vision. You also invite in other violent elements that basically you can't control. If you want to know how you're doing, the key to a civil resistance movement, which I guess is relevant to you as well, is civilian participation. The numbers and diversity of participants confronting the tyrant growing. It has to basically figure out ways to protect itself from the impact of repression, and as it gets better and better than that, the repression becomes counterproductive to the authoritarian, and by the way, that's the point in which an authoritarian has to leave. And then the key element, as I told you before, in a successful civil resistance movement is the inducement of defections among key elements of the opponent's, the authoritarian's pillars of support. And I think in what we're going to be talking about today, it's impossible to conceive of how civil resistance would be relevant to your concerns without having a strategy for finding people who are part of the system to figure out a way to help them leave it, or to be helpful for those who are working against it. So I'm 1 minute and 8 seconds less than my 15 minutes of time, and I'll stop there and take questions afterwards.